folks. Welcome to another episode of the Snowy's Camping Show. That was a bit of a radio introduction, wasn't it? Joined as usual.
Very sing-song.
I don't even know if I've got a radio voice.
Come on, mate.
This is our worst start yet.
Get it together. Should we start? Do you want to start again?
No, I'm going to keep going.
Okay.
Got to keep it interesting.
Okay.
Joined as usual by myself, Ben, and my colleague here, Lauren. How are you going?
Good. How are you?
I'm well.
Good.
Today we're talking about mould. But before we get into mould, just make sure you subscribe if you haven't already. If it's the first time you've seen us, you can follow us via YouTube or on your favourite podcast app where you can listen in if you don't want to watch us, and you can join in on the conversation at the Snowy's Camping Banter Facebook group. So if you've got any questions or just want to sort of have a look into what banter goes on, you can join that group. Now, today, talking about probably a good time because it's winter here. It's quite cold, so things are taking a long time to dry. We're talking not just about mould, but about mouldy camping gear and how to manage it, and if you end up getting mould, how to deal with it.
Yes. I think it's probably one of the most common questions that we get as well, is whether or not something's ruined. And I think that, it potentially is. It potentially isn't. Just depends on how long it's been mouldy for, how long the mould's been there for, how long it's sort of taken you to notice it.
How willing you are to stare at it.
Yes, and how willing you are to stare at it, because sometimes you might just get some sort of surface mould, really, depending on the sort of material. Some canvases are treated with they're like a mould resistant canvas. So even though your canvas can get mouldy, it's never actually in the fibre weave itself. It's just on the surface.
There's quite often called rot proof or rot.
Yeah,
canvas,
it's called I don't know, can't remember.
Yep.
Anyway, then also some synthetic fibres like nylon are so fine and such a tight weave, and they've also got like a coating of material, like on the material as well, that again the mould is very much a surface thing. Whereas if you're looking at something like chairs, or potentially even your storage bag, or tents that have been put away quite wet, like on the inner where it's not a waterproof fabric or something, or even on the fly but it's been mouldy for quite some time before you've noticed it, the mould can get in between the fibres and stain it. Even if you kill the mould spores, you can still see it. Still looks mouldy, which obviously is pretty frustrating. And
those synthetic can also, it's not so much mould, but some of the synthetics can get kind of sticky over time too. Treating that isn't, once it's gone to that point, it's no real turning back. But some of the storage solutions that we've going to mention here is kind of relevant to that as well with airflow. Yeah.
So I guess it's killing mould and getting rid of mould is one thing. Whether or not you can get rid of the stain itself is another. And if that's going to bother you, then it might be time to get something new. But of course, as with a lot of things, prevention is always better than a cure, right?
Be good to hear from people pipe in on the conversation here who live in a humid environment, because we're in Adelaide, which is dry, right? So
not at the moment. It's bloody cold and wet.
It's still dry.
But it is dry. Yeah, no, you're right. Yeah.
So if something's dry and we pack it away, it's generally still dry when we take it out again. It doesn't get impacted by humidity much, but it would be interesting to hear any tips people have who live in really humid environments as to how they store their camping gear as well, because you can dry it, put it away, but then there's 80% humidity in the air, and that's going to impact it. But yeah, prevention better than cure.
So obviously, first things first is clean your camping gear really thoroughly. I had a camp chair that I pulled out, and I'm pretty diligent with my camp gear, and it was mouldy as hell. And I realized that in one of the pockets in like the back corner was an apple core that I didn't realize was in there, did all the cleanup, did everything. And it must, I don't know, one of the kids, it was when they were a bit younger, and they've obviously like shoved it in the pocket of the apple core, because it was a kid's chair, right? Or not a kid's chair, but one of the kids' chairs.
Yeah.
And so when I sort of just did the quick sweep, it obviously had already been in there for a couple of days and maybe a bit stuck itself to the inside, didn't notice it, packed it up, got it out like a month later. And of course, when it decomposes, it's sort of off-gassing and there's moisture and stuff. And so that was obviously just great, and Mould loved it. And the chair was unsalvageable, as I'm sure you can imagine, and I was horrified.
Can't be worse than your kid's school bag at the end of the term, right?
Or at like the end of the summer school holidays and they've forgotten that they never took their lunchbox out in November and it's now February and they're just like, oh, anyway. We digress. So, but it's the same thing with it, like leaves or grass or anything like that. So just make sure you don't have any organic matter in your camping gear. Mm-hmm. Which, obviously sounds obvious, but obviously not so obvious.
Also sweat and body oils. It's good to clean that up as well. Yeah. Mats in particular. If you use a liner, something wherever you can, it's so much easier to use a liner in your sleeping bag and on a mat.
Yep.
Than it is to sort of sweat all over a mat. But if your mat's grimy, then it's probably a good idea just to clean it a little bit on top, because storage over time, those body oils will break down the fabrics and the glues and things that are holding it all together.
Mm-hmm. Not necessarily make it go mouldy, but still it is an important thing to be mindful of.
I'm digressing.
Yeah, you are. Anyway, and of course, drying your camp gear, making sure that your tent especially is bone dry before you put it away. Sometimes that can be really difficult, especially when you're talking about a fly, because flies can be quite large and being very synthetic. Like tent inners, in my opinion, are a fair bit easier to dry because air can actually flow through the fabric. Mm-hmm. Whereas with a tent fly, you might hang it out and the side up to the sky gets dry, but then there might be these small pockets of moisture because it's got a fold or a crinkle in it somewhere and that stays moist. So it can be a bit tricky.
Best tip I've got there, if you can, if it's a cold night, overnight, you're probably going to have condensation.
Yeah.
Get up and open your tent up as early as you can. Hopefully it warms up enough to dry most of that out so that even if it is a little bit wet, you're going to pack it away. The moisture's not going to soak in. So when you set it up at home, you've got less moisture to dry out when you get there. So try to every time pack it up as dry as you can. Not always possible though.
Not always possible. And sometimes I also have like an old towel like cut into thirds that I sometimes take so you can just try and soak up as much of that moisture even just for the drive home.
Yep. Storing it?
Storing your gear. I mean, it's one of those things where, I mean, I don't know if I'm really putting myself out here, but when you go to the dentist, right, and the dentist is right, like, do you brush morning and night? And it's like, well, yeah. And it's like, and what about flossing? Do you floss morning and night? And it's like, well, no. And they're like, oh, you need to floss morning and night. It's like, yeah, well, do you do 10,000 steps a day or half an hour of exercise like you're supposed to? No, you don't. Like, back off. So it's one of those things like, yeah, you should floss like morning and night. You should really store your camping gear inside if you can, like in a wardrobe.
Loosely packed.
Like loosely packed with lots of airflow and ventilation in an area that is sort of out of the weather, relatively temperature controlled, like a wardrobe space in a spare room if you've got one or whatever.
So you all need to go to the bank, get a bank loan, build an extra room to store your camping gear.
Just to store your camping gear. No, but I guess what I'm trying to say there is it's all good and well to say that, but everybody mostly just chucks their gear in the shed because that's where we have to store our gear. So it's not always ideal. But I guess when you are packing your gear, just be mindful of that and whether or not you're putting all your tent underneath your chairs and everything and how much airflow is getting in there and how tightly you're packing it and if it's what part of the shed that it's in. And I think we did do an episode on gear storage.
We have, yeah. But ideally airflow is a big one. I mean, down bags are a classic example there. You should store them lofted up. Not always possible because a down bag lofted up takes up heaps of space. So you just kind of got to do as best you can, I suppose. At least get it out now and then and air it. So tents, you roll up tents tight. There's no airflow through the fabrics and that can cause issues over time.
I think even, it's recommended with hiking flies, but I think if you've got the space to do it and you've got somewhere in your shed that's sort of relatively protected enough, getting a huge mesh storage bag and packing your fly like sort of loosely stuffed into a mesh storage bag and maybe even just hanging it up from like a rafter in your shed or something is going to be a much better option than packing it wrapped up with your actual tent in terms of airflow. But getting it out and stuff, that's a really good point. If you're not going to, say you're someone who camps maybe every 6 months, just I don't know, 1 to 2 months, maybe put a reminder in your calendar just to go out there and open some of the bags and just sort of check. Because even if you went out there at one stage and you were like, oh, crikey, there's some moisture in here, it's going to be far better off for you to notice it a month or two in than it is in 6 months' time when you go to pull it out.
Or just go camping more often. If you're going to get all your camping gear out to air out, you might as well just pack it in the car and go camping.
Just go camping. I love that enabling. Now, so I also have heard this before, and I don't know whether or not it's actually a viable option, but somebody was talking about packing, like they've bought huge big moisture sachets from like
silica gel.
Yeah, like Temu or AliExpress or one of those like eBay or whatever, like huge big packets of silica gel, and they just chuck that in with their tent and camping gear.
I've used that for hiking in humid environments. To keep electronics dry.
Okay.
Because working in outdoor shops, every item of clothing came in a plastic bag or used to come in a plastic bag and then had a sachet in there.
Of course, you can
so
save
my mate
them.
and I collected heaps of those, and then just in the bottom of my camera bag, because back when we had actual cameras,
camera bags,
not a phone.
Yes.
I just have a camera bag and the camera would go in there, but it wasn't didn't like moisture. So I just had a few of those in the bottom. So
cool.
A bit like rice, I suppose.
Yeah, that's true.
Cleaning it.
Yes.
Now, have you ever, I can't recall ever having any significant issues with mold on my camping gear and having to give it a good clean.
Oh, other than the chair, which I did actually try to clean it because I wasn't sure how terrible it was. I think when I was growing up, like a young teenager, we did have like a big 10-person dome tent. And that was our first ever synthetic tent. That did get mouldy, but I think never since then. And I think it was just the scenario of having always camped with canvas tents before and whatever, and then you have your first synthetic tent, you don't necessarily realise because you're not familiar with how it works and all that sort of hoo-ha. And it wasn't the fly, it was the inner. And we tried really hard and it was just stained.
Okay.
So,
right.
So with cleaning mould, essentially, the first things first, you should just try and dry brush it off. And it's better to use a like a soft brush as opposed to a hard brush, because sometimes hard brushes can actually push the spores back into the fabric.
Gotcha.
So something like nice and soft that like, like a duster or whatever that just sort of flicks all the spores off. And depending on the material and as I mentioned before, like some canvas, that might just be all you need. But then otherwise, just some warm soapy water, like some quite super diluted dish liquid or something. And I also want to preface that with make sure you patch testing because you don't want to just go, I'm going to clean my entire $1,700 canvas tent and discover that it's not good, right for you or whatever.
Just use mild soap. Even is it Lux, I think, a soap flake. So just like a pure soap. Don't use anything too full on.
Too full on.
Because it will, you've got the PU coatings and some fabrics are laminated. You don't want to damage, and the DWR coating on the outside too. You kind of want to try and maintain that on lighter weight tents.
Yes, and so I guess also a good thing to do, depending on your tent, whether or not it's like a polyester or a nylon or a polycotton canvas, like a little quick Google about what soap might be best to use on that can always help. But you do want to completely clean off the spores, but also just be mindful of scrubbing. Like you don't want to be scrubbing really hard because as you've said, if there are like the DWR coatings and things like that, you don't want to be taking that off wherever possible. And after you've washed it, need to dry it completely, like bone dry. And then I guess depending on how you what the material is. That sort of depends on how you're going to then proceed.
If you've cleaned it, then you probably don't need to treat it unless you have an issue with the DWI treatment on the outside. You can reapply that.
It's more just, I think, that like the argument for doing more after you've cleaned it is that just because you've washed the spores away, it doesn't mean, or just because you've washed the visible mold away, it doesn't mean there are not spores sort of left there or whatever. And if you just leave it, that same spot might just come back with mold again in the future. So you're
kind of trying to neutralise the mold as well.
Yeah, so it doesn't keep growing. And I do remember reading somewhere at one time that once like a mold spore or cell or whatever, I'm not a scientist, but once the mold physically is there, you can't actually get rid of it, but you can stop it from reproducing or something.
Oh, okay.
But anyway,
that's interesting.
There was a few canvas specialists that make like canvas tents and canvas gear and stuff that recommended 2 options. So one of them was 1 part vinegar to 4 parts water that you just apply and rinse. And then with that particular one, you got to rinse it a couple of times before you dry it. And then another one was bleach, like White King bleach, 1 part to 3 parts water. And then you apply it and you leave it for 15 minutes, no longer than 20.
Yep. And
then you rinse it off, and then you can do that again if they're still there. And I'm assuming, I've personally not used it before, but I'm assuming being bleach, that's going to be your best chance of killing the spores, but also getting rid of the colour if you can physically see the blackness in there.
Got to be mindful using bleach diluted, because if you bleach, you will bleach the colour out of your fabric. So once again, spot test a section. Quite often tents will come with a little patch with it. So I know my Oz tent's got a patch of fabrics.
Yeah.
That might be a good place, for example.
It's a really good idea.
It, so you're not doing it on your actual tent.
Yeah.
But yeah, make sure you rinse and dry it thoroughly. But things like vinegar and, at home I've used bicarb soda for heaps of stuff. I don't know whether bicarb soda would work for
I don't know either. It doesn't sort of usually when in my time of sort of Googling mold stuff and whatever, when it comes up is bicarb in terms of camping tents and materials doesn't seem to come up, but I guess why not give it a go? But
it does help the stickiness on silicone stuff though.
Does it really?
Just as a brief aside. Yeah, mix up a paste, scrub it on. I did it the other day because I got my collapsible pots out and they were sticky, and it's just because silicone.
What about like gear covers, gear shift covers on your bike? Are they made of silicone?
So. Whatever. Well, silicone apparently is still, we're digressing again. It soaks up oil.
Sorry, that's my brain going squirrel.
So even like we've got silicone baking things, and it soaks up oil over time. But apparently bicarb soda, because it's so absorbent, you make a paste, you scrub it on there, just leave it for an hour, and it sucks it all out, and they come back good.
Wow, that's really cool.
So I use that on my collapsible pots and all those sort of things. So
cool.
Anyway, synthetic tents. You can get technical stuff. So going back to the cotton poly blends, there is things like Mould Rid, like COI Leisure, I think it is, do one. There's some products that are commercially available. If you don't want to go down the path of mixing your own and you just kind of want something that says, this is specifically made for my tent, although they still all come with a disclaimer that says spot test first.
Yeah.
Synthetic tents, brands like Nikwax have a whole range of cleaners and also reproofers and stuff that you can use to
and I guess things like Nikwax, they do like a tech wash, which is a wash for technical gear. Funny that, tech wash. And you could, depending on the size of your tent, you could put your inner and even your fly in your washing machine on like a cold cycle and hand wash or something like that. And I think it's just with those sorts of products. I think Gear Aid, I don't think we sell it, but Gear Aid do. I've seen Gear Aid do something similar. Yeah. It just sort of, you know that your material's mostly safe and it's getting a good wash.
Yep.
If it comes out from the wash and it's still covered in mold, in my experience, you're likely going to have to ditch it.
If it's just visual.
If it's just if it's just visual, but like sometimes if you've got mold in your like between the outside of your tent and your seam sealing tape, like if it's under layers and things like that, don't even bother. Like it's gone. It's just going to keep on growing and it's going to invite all its friends and it's over.
Yep.
Whereas something on the outside, like you say, you might have that discoloration. You can possibly, because I was reading through a forum about hiking tents and mold, and there were lots of recommendations for vinegar and clove oil.
I've heard of I've never used clove oil, but it always comes up as a solution. Yeah,
because apparently clove oil is one of the things that neutralizes mold. So I've heard like vinegar and clove oil for your hiking tent, but you do need to re-waterproof it. So most hiking tents and synthetic tents will have, like you say, that DWR. Mm-hmm. So I think the spray that you like, solar proof, is the treatment for revamping that, and then Solar Guard I think is another one.
There's a solar one, but there's also I can't think what it's called, but there is one specifically for DWR. And when we talk about DWR,
I'm pretty sure it's solar proof.
Okay, they've changed.
Because there's TX Direct, which is that's for clothing.
Sorry, yep, that's for for clothing. Yeah,
but the Solar Guard, I'm pretty sure it's solar proof is also Knit Wax. It comes in a spray bottle. That's for your tent.
There's another one for tent floors as well that Knit Wax do. They do quite a lot and they change all the time.
And then Gear Aid also do like a silicone paste that you can do for like the inside of your material.
Yep. Okay. We should preface that when we talk DWR, we think of that as like a wax for your car. It goes on the outside and helps the water bead off. Helps with waterproofing, but it's not the waterproofing. The waterproofing is the PU coating on the inside of the fabric. If your mold has broken that down, then you can't replace the PU coating. So if you've got little bits of plastic flaking off on the inside of the fabric, then it's gone.
I think that's what the Gear Aid thing is, though. The Gear Aid stuff replaces that.
I've never used that one.
What's it called? There is a video that I did on YouTube on our channel, re-waterproofing your tent.
Yep.
And it's in there. It's sort of like, those bottles that you get for spreading like waterproofing cream on your shoes, like that, but for your tent. And it's like a silicone or polyurethane paste.
So it's probably good for small patches, I suppose. Yeah, but if your entire fly is done, then
not a chance in heck. Yeah.
But probably don't stress over all this though. If this has happened to your tent, then you hopefully you've used it and got a good life out of it. And if it's gone, it's gone. Just get excited about buying a new tent.
That's true. But I think that, ultimately loads of sunlight, because sunlight kills mold. Mold can't grow where there's sun.
I was going to say before, if you have clean your tent and you got spots on there, just leave it in the sun for the day, because that'll
fry it.
It'll help fade the stain as well. Bearing in mind that you don't want to say, I'll leave it out for a month to kill the mold, because then the UV is going to kill all of the fabric. But give it a day or so in the sun.
Yes.
Cool. We're really keen to hear anyone else's tips and tricks. I reckon. Do you know where you get clove oil? It's one of those things I've read about. I've never actually seen it anywhere.
I'm pretty sure. I think it's Thursday Plantation. They do like tea tree. They do a lavender, and I'm pretty sure they also do a clove oil, or Bostitos.
Oh yeah.
Also do a eucalyptus oil, Bostitos, whatever. Okay. Yep. Pretty much, I'm sure that both of those are available in some supermarkets, but also like Chemist Warehouse. Some of like your big.
Gotcha. Yep. So it's probably not a cheap. You probably get a little pot, and it's probably going to cost you about $30 or something like that.
I don't know. I reckon I got like a 500 ml or a 400 ml bottle of tea tree oil or something for like $11.
Okay.
Or you can get it diluted or neat.
Yeah, okay.
So it depends. I think if you bought it diluted, obviously it'd be cheaper, but if you bought it neat, it would last you longer, but it'd be more expensive.
Well, I've not used clove oil, but certainly try the vinegar and bleach options. They're a cheap way to get started, see if that works for you. But if you've got any tips or tricks, please let us know. If you've had a mold scenario.
Outbreak.
In your camping gear, let us know what happened and how you treated it, if you managed to salvage the gear, and any storage tips that you've got for giving that the airflow and keeping your gear stored in such a way that it's not going to sit there without a bit of airflow around it to make those fabrics last a bit longer. That's it. I think we're done talking about mold. Exciting episode.
I'm glad.
I can't wait to see
it's riveting episode here.
Can't wait to see the thumbnails and titles for this one. Caitlin, our copywriter, should have a field day writing the copy for this.
I actually come up with the titles now. That's why they've been a bit boring lately.
Oh, we'll give Caitlin that job this time.
But the actual description of the episode, she will love.
She'll go to town on that one. Yep. Cool.
Take it easy, guys. We'll see you next time.
See you next time. Bye.